So welcome to the fourth lecture that's taking place in week 2, and today we are covering the topic of public goods and publicly provided private goods. And the prescribed reading for this is Stiglitz and Rosengard, chapter 5. So specific in this lecture, we will be looking at the distinction between pure and impure public goods, publicly provided private goods. We'll also talk about rationing devices or rationing mechanisms for publicly provided private goods, after we've set out the distinction, obviously. The efficiency conditions for public goods, demand curves for public goods, and also how taxes might distort the efficient supply of public goods. So those are the topics that will be covered in this lecture. So now what we need to do is we need to extend our discussion of public goods. And what we need to do is we need to differentiate between so-called pure and impure public goods. So in both instances, whether it's a pure or an impure public good, it is provided by the government, except they have somewhat different properties. So a pure public good is one that is characterized by non-rival consumption. In other words, if I am consuming that good, that does not mean that you have to consume less of the good, such as the example of a street light. Everyone that stands under a street light has light from the street light in equal amounts. Well, at least theoretically. And therefore, the marginal cost of an individual's enjoyment of that good is zero. Okay, so that is what is important. That is the first quality. Non-rival consumption. Right? So if I'm consuming it, you can consume the same amount of that good. My consumption does not reduce your consumption. Then what we have is something called non-excludability. Right? That means that we cannot exclude others from enjoying that good. Because the costs of exclusion are so high, either it is completely impossible to exclude them, or the costs of excluding someone from enjoying that good are prohibitively high. So one example of a pure public good, this is what we are talking about, a pure public good, okay, a pure public good, is the National Defense Force. Why? Because all residents receive protection from the Defense Force if there is a conflict. Why? Because the Defense Force protects the country as a whole. It protects the entire territory. So anyone that's living in the territory, whether they are a citizen or a resident, in other words, they're non-citizens but simply live in the country, receive the protection of the Defense Force. So it is difficult to exclude anyone from receiving that protection. Furthermore, protection is offered to the entire nation. So that means that because it is offered to the entire nation, everyone receives an equal amount. So me receiving protection does not mean that you receive less protection, because the entire territory is now being protected. So the reason why we use an example of national defense is because this is, I guess, to some extent, a rare example of a pure public good. Okay, so if we look at this graph here, this is where a pure public good is, the National Defense Force. The ease of exclusion is low, so it is difficult to exclude someone, right? On the other hand, also the marginal cost of use is low. So those are the characteristics of a pure public good. But this is not the case for all public goods. So if we talk about a pure private good, it is very easy and it is very cheap in order to exclude someone. So for example, when you have a doctor, if a doctor treats one person, they can very easily treat another person, but at a cost. So the ease of exclusion is high, and also the marginal cost of use of providing those services by a doctor is high. So that is when we are dealing with a pure private good. On the other hand, there's also a number of intermediate goods. So for example, you have fire protection. Why? Because the cost of protecting an additional individual is relatively low when it comes to firefighting, because firefighters are usually sitting around simply waiting for calls. They are not out all the time fighting fires, because not everything is at fire. They wait for a call. Once there's a fire, then they go out. So it is very unlikely that there are multiple fires at one point in time where more assets would be required, and that requires a greater cost or incurs a greater cost. But on the other hand, it is possible to exclude someone from achieving fire or receiving fire protection. And the way that this can be done is simply by refusing to assist those that are not paying for the fire protection. Okay? So it has the characteristics, or fire protection has the characteristics of a public good and a private good. Sometimes the nature of goods might also shift. So think about a congested highway. Initially, when the highway is uncongested, any additional use of that highway incurs a very low marginal cost, or the marginal cost is zero. However, when it does become congested, what essentially happens is that a marginal cost rises. And the reason why it rises is because people are now losing time by using that congested highway. And on the other hand, it is not really easy to exclude anyone. Why? Because you would have to toll the road, and toll roads might add to congestion on a highway. So hence, a congested highway has the characteristics of a private good and a public good. And obviously there's many circumstances whether you are tolling it or not tolling it and limiting access to it. So that is where the ambiguity comes in. So let's address the issue of exclusion, because as you see, this plays, or excludability, this plays quite a role in the discussion of public goods and also private goods. Sometimes it is not a matter of the feasibility of excluding the use of a specific good. Instead, it is the transaction costs that are associated, or the costs are associated with exclusion. So that is the criteria that we need to look at. How high are the costs? They need to be incurred if we wish to exclude someone from consuming a public good. As you can imagine, it will be very difficult if we are talking about the defense force. It might not be that easy, although feasible, if we are talking about tolls. So for example, we're dealing with a highway or a road, one needs to set up a toll booth, or however tolls are set up. You can use gantries, tolling gantries where cars drive under, and photographs are taken. The bills are then mailed to those that use that road, or alternatively you can have a toll booth where you have to employ people and you have to build the infrastructure. Obviously this is costly. So yes, in theory it's feasible to exclude certain people from using a public good, but on the other hand it is costly. But this is not always the case. In some instances it is quite cheap to exclude some from using a public good. So although that public good might be non-rival, it is not that difficult to exclude someone. So think about it this way. Let's say you have a special channel that you watch. Well, regardless of how many people are watching that channel, it does not really impact how much of that channel is available to the entire nation or the entire population. On the other hand, what you can implement is you can implement some form of exclusion, and you can do so cheaply. For example, requiring people to have a decoder in order to watch that channel. So essentially, the question is, what are the transaction costs of excludability? And if these costs are significant, although exclusion might be feasible, so it can be done, the costs are prohibitive. Then we can drill down a little bit further, so not only do we have pure and impure public goods, what we have is we have local public goods and global public goods. So for example, what is a local public good? Well, that is a good that is enjoyed locally. So for example, policing, local police security, local parks. Right? The whole world does not enjoy the parks in the United Kingdom, right? The residents, or even let's talk about Newcastle, the whole of England or the United Kingdom does not enjoy those parks. Only the residents of Newcastle do. Although others could come from, let's say, London in order to enjoy the parks of Newcastle, the costs are quite high. So essentially that excludes them in a way. Then what we also have is we have global public goods. So many definitions of public goods, many types of public goods, essentially what we are talking about. So these benefits of these public goods are enjoyed by anyone in the world. So for example, the global environment, how clean the air is, how clean water is, global health, and also global knowledge. So whatever, let's say, knowledge is produced in the United Kingdom can be enjoyed by the rest of the world through internet access. Okay. So although the rest of the world cannot enjoy the parks in Newcastle, it can enjoy certain other goods that essentially have a public character now, such as knowledge. What we need to do is we need to drill in a little bit further now. Okay, so now what we also have is publicly provided private goods. I know it gets a little bit more complicated. So what are these goods? These are goods that are associated with a high marginal cost, additional marginal cost. So think about it this way, right? The government provides higher education or funds higher education. Well, that depends from country to country, but let's argue that that is indeed the case. If there is an X number of students, then all is fine. But what happens suddenly if the number of students doubles? Well, then the problem is that there is a large marginal cost associated with supplying those additional students with education. So who is it that steps in this instance? Well, government may step in. So what we are dealing with is publicly provided private goods in this instance. Okay, so if there's a large number of students enrolled, costs will roughly double. Associated with this are the arguments that government should provide education so that education is accessible to everyone and not only the wealthy. Yet, at times, there is simply no incentive for the private sector to provide education, and hence that is why government bears that additional marginal cost. So as this deviates from a pure public good, where you do have no additional cost, you have a marginal cost of zero, and instead here what you have is you have a good that is supplied by government, but there are marginal costs associated with taking on additional individuals. In other words, to providing the service to more individuals. So what is key to understand when talking about publicly provided private goods is that there is a marginal cost associated with providing these goods. And the result of that is if these goods are not paid for by the direct consumer and instead are borne by someone else, specifically by the government, then what we have is we have distortions. So specifically what happens is we have overconsumption. So individuals do not have to pay for the good. In other words, government pays for that good. They will demand it up until a point at which the marginal benefit they receive from the good is zero. So in spite of the fact that there is a positive marginal cost that is associated with it. Okay, so in other words, government is paying for it. Consumers are not paying for it. So what they do is they keep on consuming right up until the point that the marginal benefit is zero. So think about it this way. What we have is we have marginal cost. And what we then have is we have the demand curve. So what is the point at which consumers should consume this good, right? Well, essentially, if they would have to pay for this good, what would happen is this is the quantity they would consume in. Okay, so we're looking at panel A. However, because now they are no longer paying for it, they consume right up until they exhaust all marginal benefits, and marginal benefits are therefore zero, or the marginal benefit of consuming additional unit is zero. So the quantity consumed, or the quantity demanded in this instance, is greater than the optimal quantity. And that is why we are talking about overconsumption. For some goods, such as water, supplying the good freely rather than at marginal cost results in relatively little additional consumption. For some, this might not be the case. Okay, so note, nevertheless, depending upon how much is the level of consumption, how much it exceeds that at what would be consumed over marginal cost, that is what corresponds to the welfare loss that is associated from this consumption, or specifically overconsumption. Okay, so for example, medical services. What can happen is that if medical services are not rationed, people overconsume these medical services. So think about it this way. Think about someone that is a hypochondriac. They constantly believe that they are sick. Because they now no longer have to pay for healthcare, what they keep on doing is they keep on going to a doctor for every little thing, absolutely every little thing. And what is the result of that? A larger welfare loss from excessive consumption. So the optimal quantity of medical healthcare or medical care that should be consumed is Q subscript E. But because now the individual does not bear the additional cost of consuming additional units, instead what happens is that they consume right up until the point that marginal benefit is 0. And that is how we arrive at a point where we have this quantity of medical care consumed. So what is the result? Overconsumption. Okay. And in both instances, what we see is a welfare loss. In panel A, it is lower. In panel B, it is higher. So let's say that now we have a good that is associated with a very high cost of provision for the additional unit of that good, such as education we used in the previous example. And as a result of that, it simply might make sense to have the government provide it, and hence it becomes a publicly provided private good. So let's look at distortions a little bit more. So we assume that there is a constant marginal cost of production. So think of this as the marginal cost curve. And then also the problem that we have is that selling this good is also associated with a whole transaction cost. So hence what we need to do is we need to raise the price a little bit above its, or not a little bit, but to that point above its marginal cost, to such a point that the price is higher than the marginal cost and covers that transaction cost. So this is where we are looking at transaction costs, whereas here we are looking at so-called production costs. Okay, so we produce a good and then we sell it to those who want it. And those transaction costs may result in a distortion. So what is it that we can do? Well, let's say that initially what happens is that we are taking transaction costs into consideration. So given that this is the demand curve, and now that we are looking at a supply curve that corresponds to an intersection at point A, what is the quantity that we are consuming? Well, the quantity that we are consuming is Q subscript E. So what is it that happens then? Well, government can step in and provide the good, and hence what we have is an increase in consumption. So consumption increases to Q subscript O. So this is the optimal level of consumption. And what government essentially does is government eliminates transaction costs. So we now move downwards, down the demand curve, and the gain in efficiency is this triangle here. Okay, sorry, I'll use a different color. Okay, so that is the gain from eliminating those transaction costs. So government can intervene in order to eliminate transaction costs that lead to a suboptimal consumption of a good. However, government can keep on providing the good for free, and the result then is that what we have is too much consumption. So now if we are at point E, what happens is we move to point F, which is here, and the quantity that is consumed corresponds to Q subscript M at this point. So essentially marginal benefit equals 0 at this point, and that is what consumers keep on consuming right up until a point where the marginal benefit is equal to 0. Now why is this? Why does this triangle represent then a loss in efficiency? Well, the reason why that the willingness to pay is less than the cost of production, and that is where the inefficiency arises. So here what we have is we have an efficiency gain, and here what we have in this triangle is an efficiency loss as a result of overconsumption. Okay, so the gain arises because we increase consumption, so we address underconsumption by eliminating transaction costs as government. But then, on the other hand, if we can keep on increasing consumption further, what happens is we have an efficiency loss. So now the question is, should this good be publicly provided? Or up until which point should it be publicly provided? Well, using this analysis that we have in figure 5.4, we can essentially try to answer that question. So again, starting at point A, we go to point E, and then this triangle represents the gain. However, we keep on going further, what happens is that we have a loss. So what we want to do is we want to compare with the savings in transaction costs plus the gain in efficiency, and to see whether this outweighs the loss represented by E FQ, this triangle here, and also associated losses from taxes or any taxes are charged in providing that good. So therefore, if the benefits outweigh the losses, then what do? We provide that good publicly. So what we've seen essentially on the previous slide is that we can have overconsumption, specifically when we have a publicly provided private good. In other words, there will be overconsumption right up until the point that the marginal benefit is equal to 0. So what we need is some kind of rationing mechanism that determines the amount that is consumed. So what are the sort of rationing systems that we can use? Well, first of all, we have user-to-user charges. So that is essentially the price. Those who benefit from a service or a good pay for that good. It might be subsidized, so that is where government can step in, but nevertheless there is some kind of payment. So think about insurance, right? The idea is that if you're insured, well, you can take on more risk, and because you're insured, what will happen is you will have some form of moral hazard where the person that's insured starts acting in a more risky manner. So the idea is that there is some kind of access that must be paid in case there's an insurance claim. And what this does is it discourages people to make frivolous claims for anything and everything and to take excessive risks. Okay, so advantage of using a user charger system, what you have is that those who benefits are those that bear the cost. So there's direct payment. In other words, I as a taxpayer don't have to subsidize the usage or the production of a good that is not used by myself. On the other hand, it might also result in underconsumption, and also having a price system results in transaction costs. So for example, you have, again, let's go to a bridge example. A bridge will take you from A and B, and that is the shortest way. But instead, if you don't want to use the bridge, which is now tolled, instead what you will go is in a roundabout way, which will take you longer. So hence, it saves you time to use the bridge, but you might not use it because you have to pay for it, or you won't use it as often because you have to pay for it. So what is the result? The result is underconsumption. Yes, this is also then associated with the administration of a price system. So although you might be charging £100 a month, you as government only receive 50 because the other 50 goes to setting up and administrating that pricing system. So that is the problem with using a fee or user pay system. What we can also do is we can decide that we're going to provide the same amount to everyone, regardless of whether some want more or some want less of a specific good. So an example will be education. So what we decide to do is we provide the first 3 years of education to everyone that finishes school. Okay, so the problem though is that some might want to go and study for another 2 years, or in order to do a master's, or let's say to do a PhD. So hence, that is a disadvantage. For some, it might lead to underconsumption, and for others, it might lead to overconsumption. So the solution might be that high demanders may supplement public consumption by paying for that education. On the other hand, what is the advantage? It saves on transaction costs because everyone gets a uniform amount of that good, a quantity of that good. Well, there is no reason to try and regulate to provide more to some and less to others. So hence, obviously, this comes out in transaction costs. Let's take a look what a distortion would look like when you have uniform provisions. So let's assume that you essentially have two consumers of a given product. You have a high demander. Okay, so that the demand curve for that high demander is represented by this demand curve. And then what you have is a low demander, which is represented by this demand curve. Now, because uniform provision is taking place, the quantity that is provided by the government is Q star, subscript star. Now, the high demander would like to consume this quantity that corresponds to Q subscript 1. The lower demander would like to consume the quantity that corresponds to Q subscript 2. Yet they are both forced to consume at this level. So the high demander is consuming less than he or she would like to. Okay, the high demander would like to consume at this level, but is forced to consume to the left of that quantity. On the other hand, the low demander is now forced to consume more than he or she would like to. Okay, to the right of Q subscript 2. So hence the high demander's marginal willingness to pay exceeds the marginal cost of production. In other words, the high demander is willing to pay more than cost to produce that good. On the other hand, the low demander's marginal willingness to pay is less than the marginal cost. Okay, so the low demander wants to pay less than the marginal cost currently. So that is where you again see the distortions. Individuals are forced to consume either less or more than they would ideally like to, and they have different willingnesses to pay for the consumption of that good. So another way of rationing is to use so-called queuing. So when we do queuing, what we're essentially asking is what we are doing is we are not charging individuals money. Instead, we are requiring that individuals pay a cost, but do so in waiting time. So hence, you have to wait for the provision of some good to you. So for example, those that need medical services are likely to wait longer than those that don't really need medical services. So think about the hypochondriac. The hypochondriac might not need those medical services, so hence they're unlikely to wait. But on the other hand, someone that is willing to wait is likely to need those medical services, and that is exactly what they will do. So hence, you don't have the hypochondriac going to a doctor all the time because he or she is aware that they will have to wait for a longer period of time, for a period of time before they are able to access those services. So therefore, those who wait are those that actually truly need those services. What are the advantages? Well, the advantages are not necessarily allocated on the basis of who is wealthiest. The disadvantages on that is that this is still a way of paying for it, paying for a good. It is not fully free. It is not at least free to the consumer. You're paying with time. So those that have time to spare will then receive those goods, which they have to wait for, which is obviously not ideal if this is some kind of medical emergency. So the result is time wasted that could be precious in certain circumstances. So the next question we need to answer is, what should the supply of public goods be? How much public goods are we producing? So what I want you to do in order to understand this is to go back to chapter 3 and take a look at page 79. Specifically, the figure that we are looking at is figure 3.9. And this figure shows two curves. First of all, it shows a production possibilities curve where the slope is described by the marginal rate of transformation, which shows the trade-off between apples and oranges. We now replace the apples and oranges with private and public goods. So we can either produce more private goods by producing less public goods, or we can produce more public goods by producing less private goods. On the other hand, what can happen is that consumers can either consume more public goods by consuming less private goods, or consume more private goods by consuming less public goods. And the trade-off between those two is described by the marginal rate of substitution. And the point where the product mix efficiency was achieved was at the point where the marginal rate of transformation was equal to the marginal rate of substitution. So that was point E in figure 3.9. And this is exactly the situation that we are dealing with here. So pure public goods are efficiently supplied when the sum of the marginal rates of substitution over all individuals is equal to the marginal rate of transformation. Okay. So essentially, figure 3.9 represents this condition for all individuals. However, now we look at private versus pure public goods, as opposed to apples and oranges. But the condition is nevertheless the same. We need the slopes of these two curves to be tangential to each other. Therefore, the marginal rate of substitution of private goods for public goods tells us how much of the private good each individual is willing to give up to get one more unit of the public good. So this is analogous to a trade-off between apples and oranges, as in chapter 3. So the sum of marginal rates of substitution tell us how much of the private good all the members of society together are willing to give up to get one more unit of the public good, which will be consumed jointly by all. So therefore, we are now looking at an entire market as opposed to the consumption choices or optimal consumption choices of one individual. So then what we have is the marginal rate of transformation, which tells us how much of the private good must be given up to get one more unit of the public good. So exactly what we see in figure 3.9, as it is represented by the production possibilities curve and also indifference curve. Except now we're not looking at the individual, we are looking at the entire economy. So let's do a quick example. Again, national defense, and the reason why we use national defense is because we assume this to be one of the rare examples of pure public goods. In other words, goods are non-rival and non-excludable, and assume that we essentially have two goods in the economy. Number one, we have butter, so that is our first good. Alternatively, we can also produce guns, so that is our second good. And let's say that the marginal rate of transformation is 1. Okay, so what this means is that in order to produce one gun, we have to give up one pound of butter. So what happens is then, let's say that we have guns on the horizontal axis and we have butter on the vertical axis. Well, the result is in this instance that we move down the production possibilities curve because we have to give up butter and we have to produce more guns. And let's assume that there are two individuals, and these are the individuals that make up our economy. So hence, Crusoe has to give up 1/3 of a pound of butter for an extra gun, whereas Friday is willing, note, willing to give up 2/3 of a pound of butter for an extra gun. And the reason why we have to give up butter is because we need resources in order to produce guns. So hence what we have is we have a shift of resources from butter production to gun production. So calculating the amount that must be given up, or the amount that the society is willing to give up, what we do is we sum the amount of butter that both Crusoe and Friday are willing to give up. So in total, they are willing to give up 1 pound. And 1 pound is exactly what must be given up in order to produce an extra gun. So hence, the sum of individual marginal rates of substitution has to be equal to the marginal rate of transformation. Okay, note when we talk about the marginal rate of substitution, in this context, we are talking about the sum for individuals that make up the economy. Specifically, that is Crusoe and Friday. So hence, if the sum of individual marginal rate of substitutions is equal to the marginal rate of transformation, then what government has managed to achieve is an efficient level of national defense. So an efficient level of national defense is being produced. We are point E if we refer back to figure 3.9. So here's another question. How much are individuals willing to pay for each extra unit of a public good? Now, public goods are provided to individuals, and therefore individuals are not directly paying for them. So we need some kind of measure to determine how much must be paid for each extra unit of a public good. So what we use is we use the tax price. And the tax price we define as a small p. So this is the amount that an individual must pay per each extra unit of a public good. Now what we can do is we can define a budget constraint. And the budget constraint tells us how much we spend in total on both the consumption of private goods and also on public goods. So hence the sum of the expenditure on private goods and public goods is equal to an individual's income. And what this does is it gives us a budget constraint. And this budget constraint shows the combinations of public and private goods that the individual can purchase given his or her income and the tax price. So how do we bring these concepts together? Well, essentially what we've defined is we've defined a budget constraint on the previous slide. And what we are aiming to do is we are aiming to determine what is the mix of goods that are consumed. How do we do this? Well, if you recall the previous lectures, the idea was that consumer preferences are described by so-called indifference curves. And we want to be on the highest indifference curve given our budget constraint. So let's say that the budget constraint is described by line B. So this is the budget constraint that we have. For a given level of income, we are able to consume a mix of private goods and also public goods. So what is it that happens? Well, we consume at a point that is tangent to the budget constraint. Why? Because given the budget constraint, this is the point or the mix of goods which will give us the highest level of satisfaction. And that corresponds to G subscript 1 in terms of the quantity of public goods that are consumed. Now, if we relate that to the quantity demanded, we can trace this point as corresponding to a certain price level. Call that price level P subscript 1, and at that point we trace that to a quantity consumed. What happens if the tax price changes? So let's say that the tax price decreases. Now, what is the tax price? The tax price is the slope of our budget constraint. So if that decreases, the result is that our budget constraint curve swivels outwards. So we now land on a new budget constraint curve, which is described by this line. Note, there is a very important change. What we are able now to do is we are now able to consume on a high indifference curve, and that corresponds to this point here. And the quantity that we consume is G subscript 2. If we want to trace this down to our demand curve, we reflect this as a higher level of quantity demanded or a higher level of public goods demanded at a lower price. So what we see in these two diagrams is the choice for a given budget constraint of the mix of private goods and public goods to consume, and then also how that translates into demand, and specifically how that allows us to map out the demand curve, which gives us a relationship between prices and the quantities demanded at each price. Note, the changes in the price level are represented by movements along the demand curve. So essentially, for a given change in the price level, the quantity demand changes. So in summary, what we essentially see is due to changes in the price of the tax price of public goods, what we see is we see the budget constraint swiveling outwards. So that swiveling outwards occurs because prices decrease, or the tax price decreases from P subscript 1 to P subscript 2. By the price decreasing, we are able to afford, well, these are the tax price of public goods, we are able to afford more public goods as a result of that. So therefore, we are able to consume on a high indifference curve. So consumption increases from a point corresponding to this point to consumption that corresponds to this point. And we are on a high indifference curve because the budget constraint curve has swiveled outwards. And that corresponds to points on the demand curve. Note that for a higher price, the quantity demanded is lower. For a lower price, the quantity demanded is higher. And note, and this is important to remember, that changes in price levels lead to movements along the demand curve. In other words, a change in price results in a change in the quantity of a good demanded. It is not a shift of the demand curve, as you will see later on. So on the previous slide is what we essentially looked at were individual demand curves. The demand curve for individuals, that is what we derive. But how do we derive the market demand curve, or the so-called collective demand curve? So let us assume that what we have is we have two individuals. So we have a demand curve for Friday, and this is what Friday is willing to pay for a quantity of public goods, which we define as G. And then what we have is we have Crusoe, which is our second individual, and Crusoe is willing to pay a higher price for quantity G. And we can think of the demand curve as a marginal willingness to pay curve at the same time. So what are they willing to pay for an additional unit of a good? So hence, in order to derive the collective demand curve, what we do is we sum the demand curves at a given price level and the quantities that correspond to these price levels. Specifically, the quantities demanded at different price levels for each individual. So, for example, the price that these two individuals, or that the market, sorry, not these two individuals, that the market would be willing to pay for quantity of G is given by this point here, which corresponds to the sum of the individual prices that both Crusoe and Friday are willing to pay for quantity G. So now what we need to do is we need to introduce the second element. Obviously, if there's a demand, that needs to be satisfied by supply. So hence what we have is an upward sloping supply curve. And the reason why it is upward sloping is because this implies that as the price increases, the quantity supplied increases. Equilibrium occurs at where the two intersect. Now, how do we define or how do we describe the supply curve? Well, what we look at is a collective supply curve, which is the sum of the prices at which producers are willing to supply a given quantity. So this is analogous to what we saw on the previous slide. And the point at which the two intersect is Pareto efficient. In other words, the quantity that is the equilibrium quantity corresponds to this point here, and the equilibrium price at which we achieve equilibrium, in other words, the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity of supplied, is equal to this price, this hypothetical price at this point. Next, what we need to do is we need to talk about the role of taxes. And the reason why taxes matter specifically for public goods is because public goods are financed through taxes. But the problem with taxes is that it essentially results in a distortion. And this has some implications for the efficient supply of public goods. So here's the problem. In order to consume more of a public good, what has to happen is that government has to raise taxes. Now, that means that consumers have to pay more in taxes. And if they have to pay more in taxes, what that means is that they consume less of private goods, right? If you pay more taxes, you have less money to spend on private goods. So what is the result of that? Well, essentially the tax system introduces inefficiencies. So even though we have resources to produce a mixture or a combination of private goods and public goods that falls on the production possibilities curve, instead, because of these distortions, what we do is we produce below the production possibilities curve. So we now have a new curve, and this is called the feasibility curve. And what this gives us is the maximum level of private goods consumption, which is consistent with each level of public good consumption for our given tax system. So essentially, we are now producing below the production possibilities curve, or the production possibilities frontier. It's a name that I quite like. And as a result of that, we have inefficiencies in the system, and that is because of taxation. Okay, so we fall from being on this curve, or we move away from being on this curve to being on a curve within the production possibilities curve. And remember that what the production possibilities curve would do is it would represent the mix of goods that can be produced with a given mix of resources. So hence, we are no longer producing the optimal mix or the maximum that we could with the resources that we have. We are producing less than we could potentially do with the resources that we have. And that's why we are on the feasibility curve now. So in summary, the ultimate result is that because it is more costly now to obtain public goods, note because there's now a price that is being paid, the price is in the form of taxation, so remember that. That's what individuals do have to pay for public goods, although they don't pay thereafter when they receive a public good. The result is that the efficient level of public goods is smaller than it would be had there not been a non-distortionary tax. And that is what we saw with a swivel of the production possibilities frontier into the feasibility curve. And this leads us to another debate, and this debate surrounds the desirability of the level of public goods. there is a belief among some, depends what school of thought you come from, that the distortions associated with the tax system are not very big, so hence it still makes sense to tax individuals to provide public goods. Whereas others believe that the cost of raising additional revenue is great, and therefore the provision of public goods is questionable.